All right, this is the first set of notes for the unit entitled Imperialism. And this is for the section entitled The Scramble for Africa. All right, so this is an overview of the different places and people that we're going to look at as we look at how Europeans imperialized different parts of the earth. If you could see the different coding down here on the bottom, this would represent what country colonized what part of the earth. You're going to do a map similar to this, which I gave you last time, where you're going to pick a color for a European country and then color in all their colonies that same color throughout the globe. Like for instance, in this map here, you can see France is purple, and these are all the colonies that were part of the French Empire. This one right there. So anyway, your map will look something like this, and this will give you a nice visual of how imperialism impacted the globe. What we're going to look at first is Africa. And there was a couple of reasons why Europeans didn't colonize the interior of Africa until the 1800s, where we're at right now. And these are the three reasons. So prior to the 1880s-ish, the armies of Africans were just too powerful for Europeans to defeat. They're able to defend themselves against European encroachment. All right, Europeans also didn't have the technology to sail against the current of African rivers, so they were stuck just on the coast. And then lastly, the Africans were in control of the trade networks. The Europeans showed up and they drastically impacted the culture of Africa with the slave trade, but the Africans were in control of that. If the Africans had stopped bringing slaves to the coast for Europeans, the Europeans would have been kind of helpless to continue that business arrangement. All right, but things are going to change after the Industrial Revolution, after the nationalistic revolution that happened in a lot of places, that united places like Italy and Germany. Things began to change a little bit, and Europeans got to have a more active involvement in African culture and African kingdoms. One of the first Europeans that probably made it to the interior of Africa was this famous missionary slash explorer named David Livingstone. And so he was an Englishman. Again, also probably one of the first Europeans to see significant geographic landmarks and people in the interior parts of Africa. What he experienced sort of encouraged others to go to Africa as well and engage in the act that we call imperialism. So imperialism is an important term we should define before we go any further. A policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. So every time you think of a European country engaging in an act of imperialism, this is what they're doing. It's also important to note that events in history are usually the result of what came before them. So the units prior to imperialism had an impact on the existence of imperialism. So for instance, the Industrial Revolution had an impact on imperialism, as did the rise in nationalism. So let's look at each of those individually. So the Industrial Revolution impacted imperialism because European nations needed new sources for raw materials. So they needed a constant source of raw materials because they had a limited amount internally in their own nation. And they also needed new markets to sell to. You can only sell so much product to your own people. You've got to find new people who don't have your stuff to sell to if you want to expand. So the expansion of the Industrial Revolution was tied closely to the need for raw materials. In a similar way, nationalism also impacted imperialism, as nations wanted to see themselves as superior. Having colonies became a way to demonstrate the national and cultural superiority of certain European countries. Another idea that was floating around at the time that contributed to imperialism, you've heard of Darwinism before as it relates to the evolution of species, but that was applied to culture groups and nations as well in the 1800s in a theory called social Darwinism. And this basically said, this isn't Santa, this is Darwin. His idea of survival of the fittest was taken out of the animal kingdom and applied to the human kingdom in terms of culture. And Europeans decided that they had the superior culture, so they were a superior people. And because non-Europeans did not have their technology and their knowledge, they were therefore an inferior cultural or inferior racial people. That was the theory that also contributed to imperialism. And because a lot of Europeans felt like they had the superior culture, they decided it was their responsibility to share their European culture with the people that didn't have the technology and that learning that the Europeans did. It's a pretty arrogant and bold statement, but we're guilty of this a lot in our society as well. Whenever we look at someone that maybe doesn't have the material things that we have, if you've ever been guilty of thinking to yourself, how can that person be happy they don't have, whatever it is you use to complete that sentence? And so that's a sense of cultural superiority that Europeans demonstrated that we're still sometimes guilty of demonstrating today. All right, an example of an individual that went to Africa and engaged in imperialism, but also was a businessman, is this guy here. This is Cecil Rhodes, and he started a company in South Africa called De Beers Diamonds, which is still around today. And his business that he started allowed the Britain to colonize in South Africa. All right, and this quote from him is going to give us some insight in why he felt like, and not just him, but other British people, why they should colonize the world. So this quote here says, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If there be a God, I think that what he would like me to do is paint as much of the map of Africa British red as possible." This is a quote from this businessman giving an idea of why he felt like British people should be in Africa. And then the answer to the question is up here, the underlying part, because they felt like they were the first race in the world. First meaning best race in the world. All right, I don't have a bullet point here on the presentation for it, but I think this one should be kind of obvious. Number 8 on the review sheet, or the note sheet. What 2 items were discovered in Africa in 1867 and 1886 that encouraged European colonization? You don't need to know the year for the product, but the 2 products, those are 2 things that are valuable just because of what they are. And those are diamonds, like the company that Cecil Rhodes started, and gold. 2 things that are valuable just because of what they are. So before Europeans just raced into Africa, they decided they should discuss this before they participated in it. So that leads us to another event called the Berlin Conference. And what that is, or what that was, up in the vocab section, this was a meeting of European nations to set rules for African colonization. So before they colonized Africa, they got together and they set some rules. Now here's an artist's recreation of that scene. Hopefully you'll notice that there is a group of people that are absent from this meeting that probably have an opinion on what these people are deciding. I'll leave it up to you to figure out what group that is. But these European leaders got together with, see the map of Africa in the back, and set up some rules for colonization. This is what they came up with. So any European nation could claim any part of Africa. Rule number 1. Rule number 2, that country had to notify the other nations, like we claim North Africa, we claim South Africa, and they had to control their territory. They had to make sure that people living in there weren't getting out of hand or attacking nearby settlements, or just as if they're animals or something. They have to be controlled. And then the third result or decision of the Berlin Conference was that, not so much a decision as it is a result, Africa was divided up without consideration for language and cultural groups. Africans had grouped together on their own, independent of Europeans, by their languages and cultures that they had similar, And some of these language groups and culture groups did not get along together. Some of them were family and got split by the borders that Europeans drew through Africa. And so this was done to change the cultural makeup of Africa that was established before Europeans got there. A really good example for all the wrong reasons of European imperialism in Africa is in South Africa. So let's look at a quick look at some of the facts about South African colonization. So you can see when Europeans first discovered that you could sail around the tip of Africa and get all the way to India, to Asia. One of the first settlements that they created was right here on the southern tip of Africa as a nice stopping point, like a halfway point. And the Dutch were one of the first ones to set that up. So these are going to be an answer to a couple questions. I put them out of order just to be as confusing as possible. So question 10 says, what nation took over Africa in 1887? It's right here, so that's the British. What European nation had been the first to settle in South Africa? That was the Dutch. And this term here, Boers, is the South African term for the Dutch, so you can write that in the vocab as well. Boers is the South African term for Dutch settlers. And then thirdly, what was the source of conflict over these two groups? Was last down here, slaves and farmland. So these two European countries came to South Africa. They both claimed it at different times, and then they fought each other in South Africa over who should be in charge of that territory. And the war that they fought between the two of them is referred to as the Boer War, and this is an important conflict for a couple different reasons. Some people call this the first modern war before the Great War. And there's a couple of characteristics here that became standard for warfare going forward. This is how war is fought now. So it's not unusual to us, but in the 1800s, these were new tactics. So the Boers used guerrilla tactics and commando raids because they couldn't attack the British head on. So they would do these hide, jump out, attack, and then run to another hiding place. Or they'd set up a trap and they'd wait for the British to walk into it, and then they'd attack. And then also, something that happened during this war is that civilians got involved. Previous to the Boer War and in older wars, armies fought each other on distant battlefields that were far away from civilizations and people and homes and things like that, and then they would come back to civilization after that battle was fought. But during the Boer War, they fought in cities, on farms. Innocent women and children and civilians died as a result of their conflict, or were left homeless and their properties were destroyed in some cases. So that's a term for the total war, which we're going to see when we get to the two major world wars. And this is really the first war that fights in this way. It sets the stage for the world wars that we're familiar with. One last thing about the Scramble for Africa. During this conflict, there was a young man who went down to South Africa who becomes pretty famous going forward, if you know history of the 1900s. All right, this is him right here. This is a very young-looking Winston Churchill. And so that's the answer for number 14, Winston Churchill. And what did he do to become famous? I'm going to give you a three-part thing here. First, he went down there as a war correspondent. This isn't what made him famous. He just went down there to report on war actions and activities. While he was down there, he's not a soldier. He's a civilian. He helped save or helped defend a regiment of soldiers that got attacked by the Dutch. He was captured along with the remaining soldiers, and he was put into a POW camp, which means prisoner of war. And if you're familiar with that entity, prisoners of war are not frequently treated well. And after the war was over, him and the other survivors were liberated, and they went back home. And he found when he went back home, he was a hero. He was the non-soldier who rushed in to save the soldiers who got captured and survived. And so he was insanely popular when he came back to Britain, and he's going to use that popularity to be involved in British leadership all the way through World War II.